So now let's talk about data types in Python. So Python deals with data types in a rather interesting fashion. Now there are many programming languages out there with data types and you manually assign what the data type will be. So you create number, you declare a variable called number, and you set it to a data type of int or float or decimal, something along those lines. Or you may have a programming language such as JavaScript, which is typeless, where it just doesn't deal with data types at all, which becomes a bit of its own mess in large projects. The interesting thing with Python is you do not set the data type when you declare the variable, but it is a typed programming language. So basically what happens is you create the variable, you assign the value to the variable, and at that point Python will decide what data type that variable is, and it will assign the data type there. And so one of the interesting things when you're dealing with Python is it is a typed programming language, but many times the data typing is actually done for you automatically. Now with Python, when you're dealing with these data types, there's really three data types that you have to worry about. There are more data types that Python has, but the data types that you're really going to be interacting with is really going to be three. You're going to have ints. Ints are whole numbers, so this is very important, especially if you're a new programmer. A whole number means 12, 56, 5,788, right? No decimal point at all. You then have floats. Floats are numbers with decimal points. 20.25, 100.55, 1,000.66667895, so on and so forth. So when you're dealing with numbers, this is very important, because if you have a float number and you turn it into an int, or you have a float that somehow got turned into an int, those decimal points will disappear. So let's say you have some kind of cash register system. Imagine if all the cents, imagine if all the decimal points disappeared. That could be a bit of a problem. So int is a whole number, float is a decimal point number, and then you have strings, and strings are basically just text. Again, a message, something like that, hello world, a name, so on and so forth. There are other data types out there. We have sets, we will talk about in a different class. And we have some, you do have Boolean is true, false, that type of thing. But for this particular section, what we're going to be worried about is ints, floats, and strings. So here's a bit of code to show you how this auto data typing works. Now we're going to be using a function today called type, and this is going to be a lifesaver to you, especially if you're a new coder, because with type, you're able to say what a data type a variable is. So you can do print, type, and then what the variable name is, and then it will tell you what data type you're dealing with. So if you're trying to add two numbers together and it's failing for some reason, the issue might be is one number might be an int or a float data type, and for some reason the other number is a string data type. So even though it's a number, for some reason it got auto typed as a string, and you cannot add a string to a number, that's not going to work out, right? So by using the type function, this can really be, a good thing. Up here we have three variables for you to show you the different types of variables. We have a string, an int, and a float. So name equals, and then we have a string here. So this is just going to be Bob, again within single quotation marks or double quotation marks, because this is a string. We have age equals 22, no quotation marks because this is a number. Weight equals 150.5, no quotation marks because this is a number. We're then going to come down here and we're going to print out the types of these three variables. Type for name, type for age, and type for weight. When I hit the run button, we will then see this runs. We can see a class of string for Bob, a class of int for age, and a class of float for weight. Now to show you why this type function can be so useful, if I go here to weight, and again, let's say somebody's not thinking about it, especially when you're a new coder and you're plugging in all these variable values and you're like single quotation marks and double quotation marks. And so what if you put weight inside a single or a double quotation mark? It's still the same number. It's 150.5, right? But what you'll see is when we go and we hit run, we can now see that weight has a class of string, because when you put it within those quotation marks, it now sees that as a string. It gets auto-typed as a string. And so if you're trying to do math based off of this, you're going to run into some problems. So then the question is how do you change the data type? You have 150.5, it is now a string, you need to get it back to be a number so that you can do something with it. That is where we have these different functions. We have the int function, the float function, and the string function. Basically what happens is you call these functions, you put the variable name within the parentheses, and it will then turn that variable into that particular data type. Now it's very important to be careful again with the int and the float data types, because if you have a float number, 150.5, and it's currently a string, if you turn that into an int, it will become 150. Which may or may not cause a problem for you. So that's the thing to be thinking about. So basically, the int, the float, and the string functions will turn your variables into the data type that you're looking for. So here's an example of how to retype a variable value using the float function. And one of the things I'm also going to show you today is how Python can work but not do what the hell you think it's supposed to do. One of the things I will tell you, again, as a technology professional, is hard fails are good. When something completely fails, that's actually good because you know it completely failed. Sometimes you have what are called soft fails, and soft fails are essentially where you get a response that you were not expecting, you do not want. It should be a fail, but the code keeps running along. The issue you run into with soft fails is they can be very hard to detect, and they can be disastrous because your code can be running for a long time before you realize there is a horrible, horrible problem. And that's what we're going to see when we try to do this print num times num2. We're going to see what that looks like. So anyways, what we're looking at with this particular example is we're going to have num1, and we're going to use that input function to ask for an input from the user. So num1 equals whatever, 55, 566, whatever you're going to be putting in there. Then you're going to do num2 equals 3. And so basically the idea is we're going to want to multiply num1 by num2 to get an answer. Now I'm going to show you what happens if you just have that string data type here. So when you put input in, you put the input value in, it comes in as a string. And one of the things is if you multiply a string by a number, you get a weird result that I'll show you in a second. So that's why we're going to use the float function here. So we're going to bring in num1, we're going to turn it into a float, we're then going to multiply it by num2, and so we will get triple whatever num1 is. So anyways, let me go and run this. So we run this and it's asking me, for num1. So I type in 10. Now what do you think is going to happen here? Worst case scenario, what do you think is going to happen if I just do num1 as a string times num2? So we hit enter, and what we're going to see is it simply triples what we put in. So it's 10, 10, 10. Is that what you're expecting when you're trying to multiply something by another number? And this can be an absolute disaster, again, with your project, because this is the type of thing, it doesn't fail in your code. You don't get any errors. It doesn't break the loop. It just does what it does and keeps on going. So imagine, again, if you had some kind of accounting software, you're supposed to be multiplying one thing by another thing, and then all of a sudden, that's what's getting added into your database. And then it's not that it gets added into your database once. What happens if you have an accountant working all day plugging information in, and now they have 8 hours of work that looks like that? That can be a disaster. So that's why we use float, num1 times num2, and then we get 30. 30 is the number that we are actually looking for. And so this is how using either the float, the string, or the int function works in the real world with Python. And this shows you, again, some of the weird quirks that Python can have. Now those are the main data types that you're actually going to really be interacting with or futzing with in the Python world. Again, there are many other data types out there. You have the ints, you have the floats, you have something called complex, you have lists, you have tuples, you have dictionaries, sets, frozen sets, bools, bytes, byte array, memory view, none type. We have these other data types that are there, but generally how you interact with those data types is going to be different than how you deal with plain old numbers, ints, floats, and how you deal with text as in strings. So this is the idea of how data types work, how you can see what a data type is, and how you can change a data type if you need to, and to be on the lookout for when your code doesn't fail, but you really wish it should have.